because somewhere along the way, the leadership in Sri Lanka decided that they were woke. And so they had forced every farmer to go organic. The problem with going organic and organic fertilizer was all of the small farms shut down. All of the large farms had 20 to 30% crop yield reductions. The prices of food went crazy. They reversed policies 2 or 3 times. And really what they found is that, they tried to go woke. Instead, they went broke.
Go woke, go broke is Chamath Palihapitiya's simple description of the main reason for Sri Lanka's descent to complete anarchy. According to the Sri Lankan-born Canadian and American venture capitalist and former Facebook exec, the South Asian country's descent into complete chaos was caused by a number of short and long-term factors, most of which were largely avoidable. Over the past few weeks, we've witnessed a set of unfortunate events that resulted in a wave of massive nationwide protests in the island country. Thousands of protesters occupied the official homes of the former president and prime minister, demanding an end to the daily power cuts, shortages of basics such as fuel, food, and medicines, and over 50% inflation. In a recent episode of the All In podcast, Chamath, David Sachs, David Friedberg, and Jason Calacanis discussed the economic crisis in Sri Lanka and some of its immediate causes. Chamath, whose family was negatively impacted by the 26-year civil war, explains that the causes of the crisis can be traced to that war and governmental policies adopted during and after the war, from excessive money printing to a highly impractical switch to green farming practices. Please watch, like, and share this video. We also love your feedback, so ensure you drop your thoughts and observations in the comment section below. Everything helps with the YouTube algorithm so we can grow the channel. Thanks and enjoy the video.
Sri Lanka has, I think, a bunch of short-term issues and a couple of very long-term issues. Let me set the backdrop because I think this is really interesting. Let's study Sri Lanka through the lens of 2 other countries, Jamaica and Singapore. If you go all the way back to 1960, so, roughly when Singapore became a nation, the Jamaican population in 1960 was 1.6 million people. The Singaporean population was 1.6 million people. Sri Lanka's population was 9.8 million. Jamaica's GDP was 700 million. Singapore's GDP was 700 million. Sri Lanka's was 1.4 billion. Now you fast forward to 2022, Jamaica's GDP is about 13 billion. Singapore's GDP has grown to about 360 billion. And Sri Lanka's GDP is 80 billion. So, what did Singapore do right? What did Jamaica kind of get right? Because one of the things that they kept in check was their population, even though their GDP didn't expand that much, so per capita income was still quite healthy. And then what did Sri Lanka get right and what did Sri Lanka get wrong? Well, some of the things when you look at Singapore is that they found a way to embrace, despite a very heterogeneous culture and sets of religions inside of that entity, inside that city-state, they found a way to promote multiculturalism, yet also promote English as the lingua franca. Why was that small thing so important? Because it allowed them to be a hub for the rest of the world in a way that many, many other countries couldn't do. The second thing that they had was a very low level of corruption because they had a leader, in that case, Lee Kuan Yew. And again, some people in the West will paint it as slightly authoritarian. He would paint it as Asian values. But the net result of it was very low levels of corruption, a small but highly effective public service, and meaningful investments in education and healthcare to make that country grow over decades. And within a generation, that country completely, exceeded all expectations. Sri Lanka struggled through a civil war. I was a byproduct of that civil war. It was partly religious, it was partly ethnic, and it was 20 plus years in the making and in the happening. And it took a very right-wing autocratic leader, the brother of the current deposed president, to basically root it out. Now, in order to root it out, there were enormous amounts of war crimes and all kinds of things that I don't think anybody would support, except it brought some amount of stability. And so then you would have thought, okay, maybe this is the point at which you can now really start to grow. But these guys, yet again, found a way to navel gaze and just to infuse so much corruption and graft inside of how the government was run. By the way, and it wasn't just the right, it was also the left. They spent 2.5 times more on defense as of last year than they did when they were in wartime. Doesn't make much sense. The public service grew to the largest it ever did in a moment where, you really should have prioritized private enterprise. So all of these things sort of created a situation where they fundamentally didn't know what they were doing. I mean, Sri Lanka has this massive growing importance as China has emerged. The problem in these last few years is that they did everything possible to not just alienate China, but to alienate everybody on every dimension possible. They alienated China. The coup de grace was that there was an enormous shipment of fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, that was sent to the ports. And it was summarily rejected and turned around because somewhere along the way, the leadership in Sri Lanka decided that they were woke. All of a sudden, all these other countries who were there trying to help said, wait, what is going on here? So they offended China. They offended the Middle Easterners. They offended the Japanese by cutting a light rail project that Japan wanted to fund.
Entrepreneur and founder of Yammer, an enterprise social networking service, David Sachs also speaks extensively about Sri Lanka's ESG problem. A similar green farming problem is cropping up in Poland, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands, where farmers are protesting against government's plans to rein in emissions of nitrogen oxide and ammonia. The Dutch government mandated reductions in emissions of up to 70% in many places and 95% in others. Sachs argues that it is cruel for farmers to be mandated against using chemical fertilizers while rulers fly around in their private jets. Please listen as Sachs and Chamath explain Sri Lanka's green farming and excessive money printing problems.
There's a strong analogy between the populist uprising that's happening in the Netherlands with the Dutch farmers and the populist uprising that's happening in Sri Lanka. Basically, they're implementing the same policies. This is that Sri Lanka is further down the road, and it's a poorer country to begin with. So, like Chamath mentioned, in April of last year, the Sri Lankan government banned the importation of chemical fertilizers and pesticides used in farming. They, again, went with this idea they thought they could encourage organic farming. So the result of that was that overall production, agricultural production, fell by a third, and rice production fell by 43%. And rice is, the biggest staple in the country. So now you got people there starving or going hungry. You've got massive food insecurity, as well as the whole economy basically has been crippled. And the result of that is society has essentially collapsed. So, now the question is, why did the Sri Lankan government feel compelled to adopt these policies? A lot of it has to do with the fact they're getting these massive loans from the World Bank and the IMF, and the World Bank and so forth are imposing these ESG requirements. So Sri Lanka has something like a 98% ESG rating, even as their economy and society is collapsing. How is that possible? Well, they're doing a great job following the prescriptions of the global elites at Davos. I mean, this sort of global elite flies into Davos from Brussels and Washington on their private planes. They have panels on ESG, and then they prescribe these policies for countries like Sri Lanka. And this is the result. I mean, it's crazy. They've been telling us for years that somehow there's no trade-off between their environmentalist policies and creating a healthy, growing economy. And this is an example of that's not true. There are real trade-offs here. And the crazy thing is that the elites expect poor people in Sri Lanka to make up for their environmental emissions. And it's not really fair at all.
In March of 2020, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka began printing money in order to finance a growing budget deficit. Again, happens in many countries. And they did that in part to fulfill an election promise that they made that they would maintain single-digit interest rates. Again, sounds really familiar. So they printed about 100 billion rupees in March. In the next 2 years, the central bank printed 1.65 trillion rupees, right? So 16 and a half times that first number. And then as a result, what they saw was the highest inflation in post-independence history. So time after time, what you're actually seeing in Sri Lanka is not a microcosm of something that's endemic to whatever you want to call it, Jason, a developing country, a third world country,
Frontier.
A frontier country, a Southeast Asian country. In fact, it actually resembles many of the policies that exist in so many countries all around the world. And what's really important here is that as goes Sri Lanka, so goes Ghana, so goes Pakistan, so goes a whole bunch of countries where you're already starting to see food riots, food insecurity, energy insecurity, rampant inflation, sovereign defaults. And you have to ask yourself, how are we going to really tourniquet this whole thing and prevent a much bigger contagion like Freeberg just talked about?
Economies don't just break down overnight. The general economic decline we see today is due to decades of bad decisions and worse cover-ups from our elected leaders. They would rather pretend as if all is well to gain votes than address the actual problems. It's Sri Lanka today, but the island country will certainly not be the last to feel the nasty effects of flawed governmental policies, corruption, and greed. What do you think about Chamath's and Sachs' views on the Sri Lankan economic crisis? Please share your thoughts and observations below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Thanks for watching.